Welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I'm Paul Ndiho, and joining me on a Facebook Live is Shaka Sal himself, aka the Kawale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
Welcome again to Shaka Extra Time.
I'm hugely terrific to be on your show.
And a warm welcome to you, all our Facebook followers watching us live from all over the world. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to ask questions, and I mean any questions about politics and the issues on the African continent. Shaka, I think let's start with President Donald Trump's first foreign trip abroad. I think he's had some tremendous success this time around.
I couldn't agree with you more. As a matter of fact, I think it was a hugely great opportunity for him to at least try and change the narrative. And I think he's just done that.
Even some of his critics, if I was to use a baseball analogy, they say he hit a home run. Was it all about timing, or it was also about the messaging?
I think it is a combination of both, but especially the former. You realize that he was actually finding himself in trouble right here in the nation's capital, especially, the pressure from Capitol Hill, which is engaged in the investigations related to the Russian involvement or the Russian role in what they say is in fact trying to influence last year's presidential election.
But nothing has changed as far as every time I turn on a TV, the criticism is still up in the air. Everybody is still talking about whether or not his campaign colluded with the Russians. Michael Flynn has said, for example, that he's not going to testify, or if he does, he will testify and take the Fifth Amendment. More people are talking about, even as of yesterday, there are people who came up and said that he actually reached out to the other intelligence agencies, asking them not to cooperate with the FBI. In fact, suggesting that that they should actually not tell the FBI there was some kind of collusion with his campaign.
There's no question that the situation doesn't look very good for him, especially when you mention the former, though very, very briefly, National Security Advisor, General Flynn, who, as you say correctly, that he has decided to invoke the Fifth. You know, when people invoke the Fifth in this town, people begin making all sorts of interpretations. And as a matter of fact, I recall that during the campaign last year, it was candidate Donald Trump that didn't particularly really like anybody invoking the Fifth, especially when it came to the issue of the emails as regards to his previous competitor, Hillary Rodham Clinton. So can you believe that someone on his team is now in fact invoking the almighty Fifth? It means probably there could very well be more than meets the eye.
Let's go back to his trip. He, for the first time, some of his critics would say that he bowed to the king of Saudi Arabia. At the same time, a couple years ago, he criticized President Obama for doing the same thing. But that aside, I thought the speech he gave to the Arab world, the Muslim world, was significant in a sense that it laid out a way forward for how the U.S. is going to maybe engage these countries in terms of foreign policy and how to fight terrorism.
As a matter of fact, I heard some pundits talk about how Donald Trump is learning very, very fast how to be a president of the United States, and especially when you are visiting some of these people that you regard as key or major allies. It's very interesting, especially when you think about him being in Riyadh, being in Saudi Arabia, meeting the king of Saudi Arabia, and somewhat symbolically, almost in fact, behaves symbolically just like his predecessor actually did, and how he came under intense criticism that he was probably shortchanging the dignity and the image of the only superpower on this planet Earth, the United States of America. But let's face it, I think Mr. Trump has actually done himself well. He signed a deal of more than 110 billion US dollars. That's a lot. He also was able to address a very hastily convened regional summit of leaders that represent Muslim majority countries and what have you, including several African leaders. I saw especially the president of Chad, Idriss Deby, in the conference. So he's doing very well. He actually obviously moved on to Israel, and I saw him addressing the international media and talking about how he would like, for example, to visit Jerusalem, you know, and all that kind of stuff. And I remember that Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, talking about how a one-time great American president, Abraham Lincoln, had in fact the wish of visiting that holy city, Jerusalem.
That point is well taken, Shaka. Let's go back again to his visit to Jerusalem this morning before he left for Rome. He went also and met with Abbas, was able to tour the Holy Land. But when you look at it from the viewer's point of view, or people who are not even watching this program, they would say that, wait a minute, America is just playing double standards. I don't think they're interested in seeing a two-piece solution. America is interested in that region is the protection of Israel. What are your thoughts on that?
On the contrary, I think in fact it is previous American administrations, probably beginning with Bill Clinton, if I remember correctly, who came up with that idea, that initiative of making sure that there is a place for the Israelis side by side with the Palestinians, even though for the most part, frankly, the security will be taken care of by the Israelis. But I think that they are really serious, and when you think about it, the Arabs, countries, or the Arab countries, are also beginning to be not only very powerful, but also very influential. Think about that kind of deal, for example, that President Trump and the Saudi king signed, $110 billion. Can you imagine how many job spin-offs, for example, will come as a result of that kind of deal? Do you imagine or envisage, for example, the United States signing a deal with the State of Israel for that kind of money? About what?
But some people could argue that there is actually even no reason for the United States to engage in that kind of deal because they're already intertwined. They are already, Israel says this and United States, they do all things together. There is no need for them to be engaged in that kind of thing.
That's true too, yeah. But Paul, you have to realize at the end of the day, the United States is not a socialist country or even a kind of democratic socialist country like the Nordic countries. The United States prides itself in being a capitalist society that in fact believes in terms of free trade. And, there is a saying that, show me the money. That used to be said, I think, in the state of Arizona, which at one time produced one great American president, Truman. Truman himself, who obviously helped to win the Second World War. So, my friend, capitalism, jobs, jobs, jobs. You have a President Trump who came on the platform of talking about wishing to have a great America again. So I don't think, frankly, that when you talk about money, money and money, you're talking about something. Somebody has to have at least a say in what is happening around their neighborhood.
Talking about money, candidate Trump, when he was campaigning, he criticized the Clinton campaign and Secretary Clinton herself of having received money from these foreign entities, rich people in Saudi Arabia, everywhere, including the Russians. But his own daughter, Ivanka Trump, just got $100 million from some of these rich Saudis. How would you, I guess, put that into context for us? What does that mean?
First of all, when you think about politics, that frankly is not a particularly big deal, really, because let's face it, at the end of the day, Paul, when it comes to politics, it's about interests. When you talk about campaigning, it is like you trying to court an incredibly young, beautiful lady to be your wife. You put your best foot forward. And so when candidates are campaigning, they do it in poetry. They promise heaven on earth. The fact of the matter is, when they get into office, when they become elected, they have to deal with the social, economic, political realities right on the ground. And I think what you are looking at now is the difference that has necessarily to come about anyway between a candidate, Donald Trump, and a president, Donald Trump, who happens to have a lease right now, at least for the next 4 years, in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, perhaps, or arguably, the most important symbolic political address on this planet Earth.
Let's go to Rome. President Donald Trump just arrived in Rome shortly, and I'm just curious to know how significant this trip is, considering the fact that earlier on I was actually talking to our technician here, Phil, who was talking about how the Pope, for example, criticized Trump of building the wall. He said that instead of building the wall, they should actually be taking those walls down. I'm just curious to know how this whole thing is going to work out. One is pro-immigration, another one is anti-immigration.
Well, first of all, it's a great opportunity for both men to meet and exchange views and compare notes. But let's face it, there is enormous, I think, positive kind of stuff that is coming out of this trip, especially if you are a Donald Trump. You are flying out of the holy city, Jerusalem, and you are heading to Rome, the Vatican. Perhaps, of course, for those students of history, this is the only symbolic importance or symbolic institution that is a remnant of what was once the great Roman Empire. And so you are really here talking about blessings. So frankly, you're talking about the President of the United States, very much really enjoying blessings right from Jerusalem to the Vatican. And let's talk about the wall. He talked about the wall when he was candidate Trump. He's been trying to talk about it here, but he doesn't frankly seem to have any support or drawing any traction on Capitol Hill. And let's face it, the beauty of American democracy, unlike, for example, the developing countries where some of us came from, is that the past is controlled by Congress. It's not controlled by the executive. And so, yes, he can talk the talk, but can he, in fact, walk the talk when it comes to that war? The jury remains out.
Okay, that's a good segue to our next segment. Let's go to the comments. Let us start in South Sudan. We go to Jackson Sururu. Shaka, do you think the peace deal announced by President Salva Kiir of South Sudan, without the inclusion of the main rebel faction, the SPLM-IO, can bring peace to South Sudan?
You know, Jackson, there is a saying that when it comes to peace, that one, you have to make a deal with your adversary. You do not make a deal with your friends. And what is lacking in Southern Sudan really is that everybody, right from President Salva Kiir, some of his regional colleagues or supporters or whatever, they seem to be very busy trying to avoid the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is a Dr. General Riek Machar, who happens to be the chairman of the SPLA in opposition. Whether you like it or not, you're going to have to figure out a way of engaging him and figuring out how, yes, you may not love one another, but unfortunately or fortunately, you have actually been condemned to breathe the same air. They have to figure out how to do that, at least on behalf of their own people, even if they personally do not like one another. Part of the problem of South Sudan is pretty much symptomatic, really, of what happens in most of the African countries, where there is either no peace dividend or there is poverty. People do not have a guarantee of 3 meals a day. People do not have unfettered access to drugs when they get sick. It's precisely because, as some critics are saying, there is the absence of leadership. Or in fact, it could be summed up into leadership deficit, or leaders who do not have the vision thing. Because if they did really, they would think in terms of putting the interests of their countries and their people above personal and family and self-interests.
How do you respond to critics who say that maybe it's about time both leaders, Riek Machar, Salva Kiir, and all the other people who have been part of this problem, the ongoing war in South Sudan, to be taken out of the picture? Maybe we can have a fresh start.
Yes, I've had people, in fact, coming up with that kind of suggestion, that kind of an idea. But let's face it, who are those people? At the end of the day, whether you and I like it, or whether the pundits like it, the observers like it or not, the fact remains that these people are very influential in their respective communities, and they are considered by their own people as their leaders. And so, at the end of the day, frankly, I think we should cede that ground to the people of Southern Sudan. I think at the end of the day, if there is going to be something viable, something that can be sustained, if you can, in fact, restore peace in that land, that newest land, obviously, in terms of world politics, it is the newest nation. A country, frankly, most people will tell you, should not be in the business of killing each other because, in fact, on the contrary, it is so underpopulated when you consider its size and resources that, in fact, it should be even thinking about recruiting other people to come and help develop that country. Because at the end of the day, man, there is almost anything you can think about in that place, except, of course, if you are thinking about manna from heaven.
Interesting. Let's go to another commenter from Zambia. Chama says, Mr. Shaka, America and Western countries are destroying politics in Africa. When an opposition leader commits a crime and he's arrested, they call that dictatorship tendencies. For example, in my country, Zambia. Yet opposition leaders in other countries are convicted, but America and the rest of the world stay silent. Your thoughts on that?
I'm afraid I do not really necessarily agree with Chama, because I don't honestly think that what is happening in Zambia is largely because of America and Western nations and what have you. I think at the end of the day, Zambians need to learn to own the responsibility of being Zambians and being very patriotic Africans and figuring out a way, again, like in Southern Sudan, how to live together, how to accommodate one another. As I was talking before the show, it is not about, frankly, whether one is right another one is wrong. What is very, very important is to be perceived to be fair. And I think the politicians in Zambia, all they can in fact do is borrow a leaf or even a cue from some of their iconic leaders. And I'm talking about, for example, founding president Kenneth David Kaunda, a man who happened to be at the political helm of Zambia for 27 years, a man who built universities, built the infrastructure and what have you, because the last time I checked, when it was Northern Rhodesia, before it was renamed Zambia under Kenneth Kaunda, I remember there were only 2 secondary schools, because Northern Rhodesia used to be essentially a labor recruiting, ground to go and work in what was known as Southern Rhodesia, which later became Zimbabwe, where obviously President Gabriel Robert Mugabe has been, of course, president and leader for the last 37 years. Yeah. Let's face it, you have to take a cue if you are Edgar Lungu from your founding president, who fortunately is still alive, and the last time I checked, he was celebrating 95 years of good life. You have to borrow a leaf from a former president, Rupiah Banda, a gentleman, I used to be once in the military, and we used to pride in saying an officer and a gentleman. And I think Rupiah Banda is an officer and a gentleman, a man who was an incumbent president in 2011, lost the election against Michael Sata, considered defeat with grace, and he still lives a good life. I think, frankly, Mr. Lungu should figure out a way of meeting his brother, Hakainde Hichilema, so that they can figure out how to be competing, perhaps, about who is the better person or the best person in this, in the business of being patriotic to his country. Because let's face it, I don't see, frankly, why Hichilema should be in prison, especially because of the nature of the crime. A man found on a highway where the president was being driven and all that kind of stuff, and he was the only person on the highway from the information I have. To be honest with you, you would have to assume, at least when it comes to legalisms, that a suspect is presumed innocent until proven guilty. But in this particular case, I could hazard to guess, so I may hazard to guess, that in fact, HH, as he is popularly known, as we talk, is presumed guilty, and probably he has to be proven sooner or later very guilty.
That's the story of some of our African governments. Let's talk. This guy from Godwin Mwenya, he says, Shaka, is the rule of law applicable in Africa? If not, could the reasons be for its failure? If yes, what nations could be best examples for this kind of application? I think it ties back into what you're just talking about in Zambia, where somebody is guilty before he is proven innocent.
I think that's part of the problem. Yeah. And I think essentially what is needed, sincerely, when you look at the big picture, or when you look at the forest, as somebody would say, instead of trees which are going to fall down, is that what is essentially needed on the African continent is democracy. 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 By that, what do I mean? I am talking about a society where you have a system that has inbuilt checks and balances. That you have, in fact, an independent judiciary, an independent legislature, an independent chief executive or executive branch for that matter. And that under no circumstances should, for example, the executive be in a dominant role whereby it expects for example, the judiciary and the legislature to be subordinate to it. Unfortunately, that is what is happening across most of Africa. And for those three organs or three branches of government to exist independently, you also need another branch, the fourth branch, normally referred to as the fourth estate. And I'm talking about the media. And today, I think we are even, in better shape because we have social media, which has obviously produced a lot of civil journalists, civil sort of journalists, as it were. And I think that we need the media to help bring about accountability. And we also need a very active civil society.
Let's go to maybe our final question. It's from Okwerere Moses. He says, the war in CAR between Muslims and Christians, what's the way forward?
Moses, I don't frankly think that it is Muslims and Christians. I think there are some elements here who happen to be politicians, who obviously happen to be very influential, but they also, at the same time, they happen to be very selfish. They are simply thinking about their stomachs, the stomachs of their families, and some of their relatives, but not their community or society. I think what is needed sincerely, again, is leaders that look at their country and look at their people with respect, not with not contemptuously, and think in terms of bringing people together rather than dividing people together, either on sectarian grounds, meaning Muslims on one side and then Christians on the other. In fact, if you look at Christians, they are not united either. You may probably also see that Christians are divided in terms of here is Protestants and the other are Catholics and what have you. At the end of the day, it's not about ethnicity. It's not about sectarianism. It's not about clan. It's not about how tall, short you are, or female, or male. It is about social economic justice for everybody.
Very briefly, what are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow I'm going to be talking about something very interesting. It is called, very briefly, the significance of Africa Day. What is Africa Day? It has variously been referred to as Freedom Day, and in another case as Liberation Day. We're talking about May 25th, 1963, which was the birth of what was then called the Organization of African Unity, OAU, which eventually transformed into African Union in 2002 in Durban. The question is really, do ordinary Africans sincerely, do they know the significance of this day? Do they even care? That's what we're going to be looking at.